Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for October 27th, 2022. Well, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her crowd of phony progressives repudiated their letter to Biden, which had called for mildly suggesting that he engage in diplomacy with Putin. While they ran away from what was a tepid but nevertheless legitimate approach, a Republican congressman stepped forward to offer to organize peace talks. Representative Paul Gosar from Arizona put out a statement yesterday, and I'm going to read it to you because it's quite significant that as the Democrats are showing loyalty not just to Biden, but to the continuing war policy of the war hawks, which means they're allying themselves with the Bush Republicans and the aggressive neocon Republicans, Gosar broke with that. Here's what he said. If there is not one leader in our politics or our military who will attempt to end this war without unthinkable global death and destruction, then I must. This is my letter to Vladimir Putin and Zelensky, inviting them to Phoenix, Arizona to engage in peace talks. And in his letter, he calls on them to come to Arizona and take part in a discussion to put an end to the war. Now, when he tweeted it out, he included the following, quote, global political and military leadership refused to even attempt to de-escalate the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Instead of engaging in peace talks, warmongers, neocons, and the Biden regime seem hell-bent on bringing a potential nuclear world war upon all of humanity. And then he goes on to conclude, quote, let us de-escalate nuclear tensions, terminate this war, and end the death and destruction plaguing both nations. Peace must prevail, unquote. Very thoughtful and passionate commitment from Paul Gosar. Now, meanwhile, Zelensky continues his unending demands for more arms, more money, and it appears that most leaders of NATO countries are willing to do that, even as the people of their countries are suffering incredible hardships due to energy shortages, food and goods shortages, as well as inflation. And these policies have been imposed on them by their leaders, who seem indifferent to the suffering of their actions have imposed to them or on them. In reality, we're seeing a return to feudalism, where people are being treated as serfs who have no say and are losing any of the benefits of the modern science and technology that they've been accustomed to, not to mention that this is still being deprived to people in the global south. Now, as for those few of you watching who blame Putin for this, well, obviously you're under the influence of Western media with its censors, its lies, and its brainwashing. But let me just tell you this, Putin for 8 years from the time of the February 2014 coup in Ukraine, which was funded and organized by the United States with Biden as the point man for the Obama administration, that if you still think that, you ought to realize that for 8 years, Putin asked for serious negotiations to address what are legitimate security concerns for the Russian nation. And at the same time, he offered security agreements for Ukraine. But instead of including that, and instead of addressing that, he was rebuffed. Now, among the things he called for was fulfilling the terms of the Minsk Accord, which the Ukrainian government signed and agreed to, but refused to ever fulfill. Then further, instead of engaging in serious diplomacy, what are the woke knuckleheads at the State Department doing? Yesterday, they sent out a bulletin to notify people that it is Intersex Awareness Day. What are you going to do with people like that? Meanwhile, Pelosi was in Croatia, where she was promising more U.S. aid for military and budget concerns for Ukraine. Also, last week, an amendment was introduced to the Defense Authorization Bill, which was designed to lock in automatic funding for military spending for Ukraine. This includes purchases of ammunition and weapons made by Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Britain's BAE Systems. No doubt Defense Secretary Austin's former colleagues on the board of Raytheon are pleased by this. Now, if you're serious about exiting from this one-way high-speed road to nuclear Armageddon, let me remind you that today there will be another in the series of Schiller Institute conferences to address not just an exit strategy from this highway, but the establishment of a new security and financial architecture to address the actual needs and concerns of people around the world. The link to this conference is below. It will include presentations by a number of representatives from around the world, including former and present elected officials from Latin America, from Europe, and from the United States, who will be discussing what the alternative is to this continued maniac push for war against Russia. Remember, Lloyd Austin said the whole purpose of this, of arming Ukraine, is to weaken Russia. Why do they want to weaken Russia? Because Russia is playing a leading role in creating a new financial architecture, out from under the control of the usurious and predatory banks and financial institutions of the TransAtlantic region, and one which will allow nations to generate the credit that they need to develop their economies. That's what's the real issue here. And that's what's not being discussed in any media or by any politicians. The idea that we somehow have to stand up to Russia as a bully. Well, what is Russia doing? Besides insisting on defending the ethnic Russians who live in the Donbass, who are being mercilessly slaughtered for 8 years by Ukrainian military forces. Besides doing that, Russia is working on developing new technologies in energy, working with China and its Belt and Road Initiative to provide means for economic development for people in countries that have been treated as continued colonial peons dependent upon the Western banks to survive. And by the way, that's not a very decent level of survival. We see sanctions being used to undermine nations that don't go along with the rules-based order. And remember, what is the rules-based order? Who makes the rules? Do you think people should live under rules made by people such as Tony Blinken, a protege of the murderous Madeleine Albright? Is that what you would like to do if you lived in a developing sector country? That's why nations in the global south are moving away from this unipolar order. And that's why the US under Biden and under the neoconservatives in both parties has pushed to get Europe to continue to fund a war to try to, as Austin said, weaken Russia, to bleed Russia dry, to prevent Russia from working with China and other nations, such as the BRICS nations, such as the Eurasian Economic Forum, and other institutions, to establish a monetary system which is not controlled by Wall Street and the City of London. So if you are interested in that and want to make it happen, I would urge you to register and attend the online conference today. If you're seeing this update too late to do that, it will be archived. It will be available for you. There will be a follow-up conference to this in about 5 weeks because we are serious about building this new financial and security architecture. Now, tomorrow is Friday. I'll be taking your questions. You can send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com. Thanks for joining me. Share this video and work with us to mobilize for the kinds of changes that will guarantee a better life for your children and grandchildren.